Welcome to this special edition, special content to Fearless with Jason Whitlock. I am Jason Whitlock, your host. Today we want to talk, we want to reconnect with our good friend Steve Baker, who is a journalist for The Blaze and has been at the forefront of a lot of the news coverage, of the authentic news coverage of the events on January the 6th. Perhaps many of you guys remember that in the early part of March, Steve Baker was arrested and charged with some misdemeanor crimes and put in handcuffs and thrown in jail and paraded through they did the perp walk with Steve for being a journalist who covered January 6th and continues to cover January 6th. Steve is back in the studio with us. This this content is brought to you today by Patriot Mobile. Switch today to Patriot Mobile. Get the same great nationwide coverage while supporting the conservative values you believe in. Go to patriotmobile.com/Jason or call 972-PATRIOT. Steve, welcome back to the program. We've been talking about you for several months. I don't know I was anticipating you getting arrested, although when we first connected, you said it was a possibility.
Right.
Give us an update on where things stand now and just, I was asking you off the air, did they actually throw you in a cell? Take us through the process. What all did they do in early March?
Yeah, well, the first thing that happened is just before I was required to self-present or self-surrender to the FBI, we negotiated a date between my legal team and the FBI for when and where I would do that. We chose Dallas because I was working there at the Blaze at the time. Even though I live in North Carolina, I could have done it in North Carolina, D.C., or Dallas. It was my choice. We chose Dallas because I was there. And then we received an email, Jason, from the U.S. attorney to my attorney requiring me to show up for my self-surrender at 7 a.m. on March 1st, Friday morning, wearing, and I quote, shorts, a T-shirt, and flip-flops. That's how they wanted me to arrive. Of course, we defied that. I defied that. I showed up in a jacket, tie, professional attire. And when I arrived, my attorney went up to the FBI agents that were there to greet me at the gate at the field office in Dallas and negotiated that I would not be put into an orange prison jumpsuit, that I could keep my slacks, I could keep my dress shirt on, but of course I had to remove my shoelaces, my belt, my tie, and hand my jacket over to my attorneys. And then I went in, they processed me, fingerprinted me, patted me down, put me in cuffs behind my back, marched me out to their car, where then they transported me over to the U.S. Marshals at the federal courthouse in downtown Dallas. And then once the U.S. Marshals got me, then they put me in leg irons. They put me in a belt chain that had my wrist, chained to my stomach, and then put me in a lockup in a cell with an actual meth dealer.
Couldn't they have just required you to meet them at that location you're talking about where the cell was?
Correct.
They could have just, all this rigmarole, you could have just showed up there.
Well, that's what they typically do with nonviolent misdemeanor offenders. And that's what I'm charged with, or nonviolent misdemeanor crimes. The same 4 basic misdemeanors that all of the January 6th low-level offenders are charged with. And so if you're a J6 defendant, though, you are treated as a terrorist, a misdemeanor terrorist, legally let that soak in, if you can wrap your mind around that one. But that's the way you're treated. Whereas an actual felon in the courtroom that day for her hearing, she was allowed to wear her nice dress, come in with her attorney. She was not cuffed, but I was cuffed and marched in with actual accused drug dealers and other criminals of that sort into the courtroom wearing leg chains. Yeah.
So how long were you in a cell?
I was in and out of that cell for about 5 hours because they'd take me out to, I'd have to have a meeting with my attorneys at one point, and then they took me to the to the courtroom, and then brought me back to the cell. And then, of course, I had to go through the whole, processing with, again, fingerprints and mug shots and that sort of thing with the U.S. Marshals. So I was in and out of that cell for about 5 hours.
And so what's next? When's the next time you have to be in court, or what do they do from here?
My actual arraignment is on the 3rd, next week, April the 3rd. So, and that's a Zoom hearing, so I don't have to go to D.C., I don't have to go to a courtroom. It'll be a Zoom hearing with my judge. I have an assigned judge now. My assigned judge is an interesting coincidental assignment. It's the exact same judge, Christopher Cooper, D.C. Judge, that is the same judge that held Catherine Herridge of CBS in contempt for not turning over her sources. It's a coincidence, I'm sure.
and so what are the charges for, explain this again, what did you do illegally?
Well, I've got the glorified trespassing charge, entering a restricted space. Then there are 2 charges that are kind of redundant, but they're 2 separate codes in the federal regulations for abusive and loud language, which did not happen. And
Were you playing a rap song at the time?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I was singing and chanting and rapping and dancing, and then that leads us to the 4th, again, absolutely absurd charge, which is the picketing and parading charge. And of course, I carried no signs, I carried no flag, I wasn't wearing any political attire whatsoever, no MAGA hat, nothing. I was in there doing my job as a journalist and behaving myself accordingly, just as 60 other journalists did that went through those broken windows and open doors before I did. And then I exited the building once an officer, for the first time, 37 minutes later, an officer, young female Capitol Police officer, came up and took me by the arm and said, "Sir, can I safely escort you out of the building?" I said, "Do I need to be?" She said, "Yes." I said, "Okay." That was it. And that was the end of my day in terms of exiting the building. So no resistance, no violence, no property damage, no resisting law enforcement orders or commands. I behaved myself exactly as I was supposed to behave myself as a journalist. And then they waited over 3 years before they required me to turn myself in.
Any other journalists being charged with the same thing as you?
Yes, there have been, but they're not if they reported their stories or gave their films and their videos to left-leaning or mainstream media sources. Only those of us who have reported with the unapproved narrative of January 6th have been arrested. About 8 or 9 of us so far.
Same thing as you?
Correct.
And they're all conservative? Or
that is correct.
Conservative media outlet?
Yeah, and the first such journalist that was arrested was a professional videographer out of Pensacola, was actually there doing work contracted by a mainstream television station out of Mobile, right across the bay there in Alabama. And he committed the obscene crime of being an activist with the Latinos for Trump organization before he got there. And so even though he behaved himself absolutely perfectly as a journalist, had the big camera gear, he wasn't in there with his cell phone. He showed up to cover the event. He went in, behaved himself, didn't chant, didn't join in any parading, picketing, no abusive language, none of those things. He got the same 4 misdemeanors that I'm charged with, and he determined that he was not going to plead out. They offered him the opportunity to plead out to a single charge, and then he could do like 2 or 3 years probation, no jail time, pay a $2,000 fine. And he said, "No, I'm not going to plead guilty to something I did not do, especially if you're not charging all of these other journalists with the same exact crime." So he went to court, and he was found guilty, and they sentenced him to 8 months in prison. And Jason, nonviolent misdemeanor. The first 2 months in a medium security prison in Georgia, they threw him into solitary confinement. When he got out into the general population, his name is J.D. Rivera, by the way, from Pensacola. When he got into the general population 2 months after being in solitary, they thought he was like a narc or some sort of spy or whatever, for the system, because he told them he was in there for misdemeanors. And all the prisoners are going, misdemeanor criminals don't come to this prison. We're pros. This is, committing crimes and going to prison is what we do for a living, and nobody comes to this prison for a misdemeanor charge. He says, you do if you're a January 6th defendant.
Good Lord, man. Is he still, is his...
He's out, he's back home, rebuilding his life and doing well.
And so you're not planning to plead out?
Not planning.
And so you think that's a possibility for you?
Anything's a possibility for me. In fact, I would conjecture that the possibilities for me are potentially worse, because the Department of Justice is not happy with me. I've been poking that bear for 3 years now, significantly hard. And then additionally, because of the work that I've been doing revealing corruption at the highest levels of the Capitol Police, I'm not going to name names today, but at the highest level of the Capitol Police, they are screaming for my head to be put on a prosecutorial platter and delivered to them.
So I've seen some people ask this question. I find it a foolish question, but I've just seen it asked, and I've seen people that call themselves journalists ask this question. Well, did Stephen Baker, did he have credentials to cover January 6th? And I just don't, was there some kind of credentialing process? I don't think January 6th was the actual Super Bowl where you went to, but anyway, what do you say to people? Did you have credentials?
Well, the FBI asked me that question. I said, yes, the First Amendment. And they went, But did you work for any agency at that time? So no, I was independent. So you did not have actual credentials. Well, no, I didn't. But Jason, this is what everyone needs to understand. There's two aspects to this. First of all, there's not a law, state, local, federal, that requires anyone to have credentials for anything. There are rules. There are rules established for certain events. I mean, the first time I got press credentials was I applied for credentials to cover the Ryder Cup in Spain back in the 90s. That's the first time I ever applied and got credentials for anything. And that was not a legal issue. That was just by the organizers of the Cup. And so if we're talking about credentials, we have to understand the first and most important rule of Journalism 101 is that no credential, it doesn't matter if it's a congressional press badge, which I have one now, it doesn't matter if it's a congressional press badge, it doesn't matter if it's New York Times, Washington Post, if you cross into a restricted area or behind a police line, you are subject to arrest. Unless you crossed into that area with the express permission of law enforcement, which they generally grant that because they understand that the public interest in most stories it's vital for the press to do that. So what happened specifically on January 6th, there were about 100 journalists, photojournalists, and written print journalists already in the Capitol to cover the electoral vote certification. So they're already in the building. They're there, and they're there by invitation, okay? So they're legally in the building. Then there's another 60 of us that came through the open doors or the broken windows, which some of them went through. The fifth guy through the broken window, the first broken window at the Capitol, was a New York Times reporter. And it doesn't matter if he had 10 credentials hanging on his lanyard, he broke the law, technically. So if they're going to charge me and not make it a case of selective prosecution because I don't comport with the preferred narrative, then they have to charge the other 60 as well. But they haven't done that.
Arraignment coming up here shortly. When would this reach a crescendo? When could will this wrap up before November, before the election, or?
I don't see any way that I go to trial before the election. I mean, we're going to be burying the Department of Justice in all manner of motions related to my case, discovery requests. They will be doing the same. There will be just endless months of back and forth between motions filed, motions rejected, rejections challenged. You know, that kind of stuff is going to happen. And this is a waste of not just taxpayer money and government resources for a nonviolent misdemeanor glorified trespasser, if you want to call it that, for us to have to go through this. But Jason, if I have to go through this in order to shine the light on the corruption, more so that's happening to people being treated far worse than I am. I have other January 6th defendants that are a little bit red-assed about this because I'm getting all this attention. In their cases, they suffered much worse abuse than I did. I'm getting the attention because I work for the Blaze. I'm getting the attention because this is a huge First Amendment challenge. And you know what? I'm going to do everything in my power for them to reflect that attention back on their cases and bring the Americans' attention and knowledge of the overall abuse of this whole January 6th prosecution process.
Is there anybody on the corporate side, legacy media side, who is championing you and your case? It seems like we should be circling the wagons around you. It seems like they should be smart enough to know, hey, look, if they can do this to Steve Baker, one day this will be us.
There's been a couple of cracks in that, that big fortress there. Jonathan Turley wrote a very favorable article about my situation. Also, we got...
Where at?
It's on, I don't remember where it was posted, but then I got a really favorable coverage from The Hill, which was interesting. And then there's been a couple of others that are like marginal, but they're going to have to realize, especially after what we just saw a couple of days here in Nashville, a legitimate young reporter with his credentials hanging around his neck was just ambushed by the campus police and arrested. And he's just, literally doing nothing but covering an event. Quietly, nonviolently, off to the side, doing what a journalist does, doing exactly what I did on January 6th. And this is happening all over, and so I think they're going to have to wake up quickly, or it's going to sneak up on them, and they don't realize that. The
other thing I wanted an update on when you're in town, good to have you here, Harry Dunn, the large police officer, black guy, light skin, that was at the forefront of this whole racist rally on January 6th, and he got called every name in the book. You guys know Harry Dunn. We've talked about him before. The big dumb cop that was a private with the Capitol Police for 16 straight years. Harry Dunn is now, you tell me, he's running for Congress.
He's running for Congress. He actually resigned from the force back in December. We do not believe for a second that this was not a forced out. We believe that he was forced out. I believe that Capitol Police leadership came to him and told him he needed to leave, and I'll explain why. First of all, we've done a series of stories on him, as you know, through the Blaze. And one of the most recent stories we showed was that he had actually committed a fraudulent act, since I've seen you, where he actually participated in, shortly after January 6th, he created on Capitol Police letterhead a letter that was distributed among all of the Congress people on the Hill. It was a political, highly partisan letter. He did it anonymously. He used Capitol Police resources to create the letter, used the assistance of the mainstream press pool there at the Capitol, help him draft this letter, and then he was disciplined for it. He actually created a fraudulent act, and he got a quiet slap on the wrist, and they buried that because he was then the hero of January 6th, had been elevated to that status, so they couldn't quite punish him. But then this series of stories that we've done have ratcheted up the attention not only to that disciplinary action, but a series of disciplinary actions he's had over the course of his career with the Capitol Police during that 16 years, which is probably why he never made it past private to begin with. But with all of this series of disciplinary actions beginning to come to light, I think that they gave him a pat on the back and said, "You need to move on, Harry." And he decided to run for Congress. So he announced his candidacy when he resigned back in December.
And so, I mean, he sounds like a perfect, ideal candidate for the House and for political office. For 16 straight years, he couldn't advance on his job. He's told some lies. He's very comfortable with being dishonest. That sounds like a great politician to me.
Yeah, I mean, going from a pathological liar to Congress, that's a lateral move. So,
wow. Beyond your case and beyond anything else going on with January 6th and any of these other cases involving other people that we should be updated on or paying attention to?
Yeah, there's a lot going on, Jason, but the most important thing that we're working on through the Blaze right now is related to January 6th, although not January 6th specifically, is as I've began this process of investigating officers like Dunn and Special Agent David Lazarus, who perjured himself in the Oath Keepers trial. Well, then we start learning about the cover-up and the upper level and deeply corrupt leadership at the Capitol Police itself. So we're starting the process now of rolling out a series of stories related just to the corruption of the Capitol Police that has nothing to do with January 6th, but the intersection. It was the intersection that got me there.
Steve, thank you for stopping by. We'll continue to keep you in our prayers, and this is another reason why we need to get Trump elected. So hopefully he will make all these cases disappear. But thank you, Steve. Good to see you.
Thanks, Jason.
Godspeed. That's it, and that's all for us. Thanks for watching.